Right now, 2.3 million Australians own at least one investment property. And if you are somewhere between 55 and 65, the ladder you have been climbing your whole working life is about to hit a ceiling nobody in the property industry wants to talk about. You have probably been told to hold your rental forever for passive income. But for someone close to retirement, a rental property is rarely passive. It is closer to a second full-time job, and starting from the 1st of July 2027, that job is about to get a lot more expensive. Here is the stake. If you bought an established property as an investment after 7:30 in the evening on the 12th of May 2026, the new rules mean you lose the ability to offset your rental losses against your salary once that 1st of July 2027 date arrives. If you are planning to retire soon and your taxable income is about to drop, you could be left holding a property that drains cash every month with zero tax relief behind it. For some people, that is $15,000 to $20,000 a year coming straight out of pocket. Today we are breaking down the 5 levels of being a landlord in Australia, and we are doing it through one lens only, the lens of someone who wants to stop working, not start a new unpaid career as a property manager. Along the way, we will show you the exact point where your portfolio stops working for you and starts quietly working against you, what I call the burnout threshold. If you are trying to work out whether your property portfolio is a retirement nest egg or a ticking time bomb before these 2027 tax changes land, subscribe to Aussie Retirement with Bob. We spend our time on the numbers that actually matter once the salary stops coming in. The new negative gearing changes are built around established dwellings specifically. Say you are earning $95,000 a year and you bought an existing house as an investment after that cutoff point in May 2026. Once the 1st of July 2027 arrives, you will not be able to claim your excess rental losses against that salary anymore. Not a smaller deduction, zero. That number is doing a lot of work because it changes the entire reason a lot of people bought their first rental in the first place. Level 1 is what I call the accidental landlord. You did not set out to be an investor. You moved in with a partner, you inherited a place, or you simply could not bring yourself to sell the family home, so you rented it out instead. Level 2 is the intentional investor, someone who went out and bought a second property on purpose, specifically to build wealth through growth. This is the part that catches people out at both levels. Most people did not buy these properties because the rent covered everything. They bought them because the tax refund covered the gap. Take a typical property valued around $928,421 in today's market. At 6% interest, that is roughly $55,700 a year in interest alone. Rent it at $32,495 a year, and you are already $23,200 short every year, before rates, insurance, or a single repair bill. The tax deduction was quietly covering that gap. Once it is gone, the gap does not disappear. It just becomes your problem. Now, if you are sitting there feeling like you missed a memo, you did not do anything wrong. I have watched this happen to people who did everything the textbook told them to do. It is not your fault the rules changed mid-game. You were following the standard Australian wealth playbook, the one everyone from your accountant to your brother-in-law told you to follow. But nobody puts this trade-off in writing. Every year you hold a property propped up by a deduction that no longer exists, you are not just losing cash, you are losing flexibility. A level 1 landlord in particular is not really running a tax strategy anymore. They are sitting on a liquidity trap. Your equity might look enormous on paper, but you cannot sell the spare bedroom to pay for a grandchild's flight home or a new hot water system. The house is either fully yours or fully sold. There is no in-between. So what happens when a level 2 investor tries to do what the property seminars always told them to do? Use that growth to buy a third property. That is where the bank stops looking at your income and starts looking at your birth certificate. By level 3, you are not just holding one or two rentals anymore, you are using the equity in what you already own to fund a third property, and sometimes a fourth. On paper, this looks like the smartest move in the whole game. In practice, this is usually where the bank quietly closes the door on you, and almost nobody sees it coming until it happens. Lenders do not just look at your income once you are in your mid-50s. They apply what is called a serviceability sensitivity rate, which adds roughly 3% on top of whatever rate you are actually paying. Then they test whether you could still cover every mortgage at that higher number. On top of that, they start asking how many working years you have left, because a lender wants to know the loan gets paid down inside your earning life, not your retirement. This is not the bank being difficult for the sake of it. Every lender in Australia has to meet responsible lending obligations, which means proving on paper that you could still make every repayment if your income stopped tomorrow. For someone in their 50s, that assumption gets a lot harder to tick off, no matter how strong your equity looks on evaluation. I want you to meet Gary. He is 58, and he has built up $1,400,000 in equity across 2 properties over about 20 years of careful buying. He did everything right on paper for 2 decades. On paper, he looks like a success story. When he applied for a third loan, the bank turned him down, not because his equity was too low, but because his plan to eventually sell one of the properties was not an acceptable exit strategy for a loan written over a 30-year term. I used to think equity was king. Watching cases like Gary's, I have realized that once you are in your late 50s, cash flow is the only thing that actually keeps the lights on. Equity on a valuation report cannot pay a mortgage repayment. Only rent or your salary can do that. This is not just Gary being unlucky. The Reserve Bank's May 2026 bulletin noted that lending to investors aged 55 and over has tightened by 15% year on year, driven by lenders reading the responsible lending rules more strictly around what retirement income actually looks like. That is not a rumor from a mortgage broker. That is the regulator watching the same trend play out across the whole country. Here is the cost that never shows up in a bank's risk assessment. Every year spent chasing a fourth property is a year not spent simplifying the 2 or 3 you already own. The energy goes into finding the next deal, not into making the existing ones actually pay for your retirement. That is the quiet cost of chasing scale once the bank has already told you no. If Gary thinks a knockback from the bank is his biggest problem, he has not seen the land tax bill waiting for him at level 4. Once your portfolio grows past 3 or 4 properties, a lot of investors get pushed toward trusts and self-managed super funds, usually on the advice that the structure protects assets and manages tax more efficiently down the track. What almost nobody sits you down and explains is what that same structure does to your land tax bill. In Victoria, the general land tax threshold for 2026 sits at $50,000. Hold that same land inside a trust, and the threshold drops all the way down to $25,000. A property with a $1 million land component, which is not unusual in most capital cities now, can trigger a land tax bill of $9,000 or more every single year. 5 years ago, that bill on that same property simply did not exist. Ask yourself honestly whether the accountant who set up that trust ever walked you through this number, or whether asset protection was the only benefit anyone mentioned. Most people say no. The protection is real, but it came with a cost nobody put on the whiteboard. Add the extra accounting and audit fees a trust or self-managed fund requires every year, and the true cost of that protection starts to look less like a shield and more like a bill that never stops arriving. We have seen this pattern play out before. Back during the 2008 financial crisis, credit dried up almost overnight, And investors who were carrying high land tax alongside high interest costs were the first ones pushed into fire sales, selling at exactly the worst possible time because they had no cash buffer left to absorb either bill. That same warning applies now. Interest rates and land tax do not care whether you are ready to retire, they only care whether the bill gets paid. This is where the real trade-off in your portfolio shows up. There is what I would call the resilience path, where you consolidate down into one high-yield commercial property or a single residential property that is fully paid off and owned outright. And there is the fragility path, holding four negatively geared houses with no salary left to offset the losses against, because you have retired and that shield is gone for good. One of these paths lets a downturn roll past you while you keep sleeping at night. The other one turns a downturn into a forced decision you make under pressure at a price someone else sets, not you. Nobody plans to end up on the fragility path. Most people just never sat down and compared the two. But level 4 is not even where the passive income promise finally falls apart. That happens one level up, at level 5. By level 5, you are no longer really an investor. You are running a small, high-risk company, whether or not you think of it that way. Your assets have likely moved into commercial property, a development site, or a fully self-managed super fund, and every one of those choices brings its own layer of compliance, insurance, and personal risk that a single rental back at level 1 never had. Why does the workload keep climbing instead of easing off? Because each new asset class comes with its own set of rules. Commercial leases need to be negotiated and reviewed. Development approvals need to be chased through council. A self-managed super fund needs its own audit every year, with your name personally attached to every decision. None of that runs itself, no matter how experienced you are, and none of it shows up in the glossy photo of the finished building. Only about 10% of property investors ever reach 3 or more properties, and most of them are proud of what they built, and rightly so. But pride can make it hard to see what the portfolio is quietly costing you. Psychologists call this the endowment effect, where we value something more simply because we own it. That is exactly what lets us ignore the 40 hours a month that can disappear into admin, insurance claims, and tenant disputes, because in our own head, the asset still feels too valuable to question. It becomes background noise you have learned to live with, right up until you finally sit down and add up the real hours. I remember a client who spent the first year of his retirement, the year he had been planning for since his 30s, arguing with a tribunal over a $400 carpet cleaning bond, not managing a growing portfolio, not enjoying the freedom he had worked for, arguing over $400 while his grandkids were at the beach without him. That is the level 5 trap in one sentence. The bigger the portfolio gets, the more of your retirement it asks you to hand back, in hours, in stress, in weekends, spent on hold to an insurer instead of anywhere else you would rather be. None of that makes you foolish for building what you built. It just means the portfolio has quietly outgrown the retirement it was supposed to fund. So, if the income is real but the headache is not worth it anymore, how do you actually get one without the other? If everything up to this point has felt heavy, here is the part that actually gives you back control. This is not about selling everything at once. It is about testing each property against a number, one at a time. Start with a yield audit. Take the actual rent you collect, subtract every real cost, interest, insurance, rates, agent fees, and maintenance, and see what is left as a percentage of the property's value. If that net yield is below 3.25%, the current upper deeming rate on ordinary savings, you are working harder for less return than money sitting in a simple, low-effort account. That is worth knowing on paper, in cold numbers, before emotion gets involved. If a property fails that test, look at a 2-year sell down instead of one big rushed sale. Because of the 50% capital gains discount, spreading the sale of multiple properties across 2 financial years selling one just before the 30th of June and the next just after the 1st of July can keep you out of a higher tax bracket in either year rather than copping the whole gain at once. And for whatever you decide to keep or bank as cash, remember where that money can eventually sit. Once you turn 60, withdrawals from a taxed super fund come out completely tax-free. For a lot of people, that single fact changes the whole calculation because it means the goal is not holding property forever. It is getting your wealth into the account that lets you actually spend it without a tax bill attached. None of this has to happen in a single afternoon, and it should not. But if you want more Australian-specific breakdowns like this before the next round of tax changes lands, subscribe to Aussie Retirement with Bob so you do not miss the next one. Being a landlord in Australia is still a completely valid way to build wealth. But the ladder changes once you are past 55, and pretending it does not is how good years get lost to stress that was never necessary. The 2026 tax changes, combined with the simple reality of getting older, mean holding everything forever is no longer automatically the safest choice, even though it used to be the default advice for decades. You worked hard for the equity sitting in these properties. Do not let what was supposed to be a second income turn into a second full-time job that quietly eats the retirement you actually earned. If this helped you see your own portfolio a little more clearly, subscribe for more Australian-specific retirement strategy. I am Bob, and I will see you in the next one.